Good morning and welcome to Positively Politics, the show where we break down the sometimes complicated and often negative world of politics in a straightforward and academically rooted way. My name is Dr. Merrifield Wilson. I'm an associate professor of political science here at the University of Indianapolis, as well as the show's host. And I want to thank you for tuning in and welcome you here this morning. If you have not caught the show before, Positively Politics is all about asking the questions, inciting conversations, bringing in data points, and also historical context to provide what I hope becomes a greater understanding for what's going on in the political world today. And if you've caught the show recently, I've spent a lot of time talking about the state legislative session and promised, and I'm making good on that promise today, promised to talk about this upcoming election cycle because we are now in full swing for the primary season. And of course, primaries lead now right into our general election. So very exciting time in politics. So I want to start with this. When we're talking about what makes an effective campaign, right? The very baseline, of course, is winning. And I think that's obvious. For some people, it is limited just to that. And understandably so. In American politics, we have winner-take-all systems where you get a majority, or in some cases, in Indiana, for example, you can just get a plurality of the vote and you are good to go. It doesn't matter. You've won. You don't need to worry about anything else. And likewise, if you aren't the winner, you get absolutely nothing. Now, if you listen to the show, I like to talk a lot about margins and turnout because those are also important indicators, though understandably from a campaign success perspective, they're not very helpful, right? You love to see that your candidate, your race yielded high turnout, but it's not helpful, not as helpful, at least if your candidate doesn't win. And same thing in terms of margin. A close race is really good, but less helpful again if your candidate is not ultimately successful. So I wanted to start at the beginning and focus on really important aspect of American politics in terms of endorsements. And I'm going to talk about this both in terms of Indiana, but also nationally, and really focus on when do endorsements matter, and narrowing it down specifically, how much do Donald Trump's endorsements matter? And the reason I'm focusing on our president's endorsements is because we've seen the president make a number of endorsements. In fact, going from his first administration, he actually made 305, right, is by best count. But even if you're talking about more endorsements since then, in this election year alone, there have been 261 primary endorsements. Right? So I want to talk about what does that mean? What does that look like? And that is really important and helpful, I think, especially in comparison, because if we look at other presidential candidates, right? Now, Barack Obama has not made any, to my knowledge, this election cycle, but his last, maybe I'd say the peak, like the last time he had the highest number, was that he made 342 endorsements back in 2018. And so we talk about these presidential endorsements, right? Let's discuss what the endorsement looks like and why it can matter. Right? For starters, endorsements can be incredibly simple for a campaign and yet incredibly coveted. So having an endorsement, and let's say from a sitting or a former U.S. president, is a very big deal because that is the candidate saying, this is the person I would pick. This is the person I would select. I always think of it tantamount to if they were creating a softball team, a kickball team, I don't know, whatever kind of team it is. It doesn't have to be a sport. Well, if they were creating a trivia team, right? Who would they want on their team? Now, sometimes these feel really obvious. When is it most obvious? Well, in a general election, when you would expect a Republican president to select the Republican nominee and to give them perhaps his endorsement. But there's a difference between just simply supporting and endorsing, right? The support is assumed based on partisanship, again, going to a general election, and it's implied, it's understood, right? The endorsement is you have earned the gold star seal of approval. This candidate likes you enough to tell other people that they like you and to give a formalized endorsement, even if it is truly just the candidate saying, this is the person I endorse in this race, right? That kind of endorsement matters. Now, you're listening here to Positively Politics on WICR 88.7 The Diamond. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson, as we're talking today about the role of endorsements, right? What are they? What value do they play? What are their limitations? And I'm starting talking about President Trump's endorsements here because, as you can imagine, with a seating somebody who's currently in the office, incumbent president, those endorsements can be very influential. And part of what makes an endorsement matter is that people know who the endorser is, right? It is worthless if somebody is endorsing a candidate and you don't know who they are. Now, it might be that you're not the target market. It might be that you didn't like that candidate anyway, and all those things are just perfectly fine. But for the endorsement to matter, for the endorsement to have any weight, people need to know, and then follow up, also really important, people need to like the person. They need to want that endorsement. This is where I think endorsements can play roles for both supporters and opposition in a way that, it's a kind of common sense, but we don't think of it always. And it's the same way, I think, for interest groups, because interest groups provide endorsements. Interest groups can be invaluable in those. Interest groups also provide ratings to evaluate candidates they like and support. And they'll provide these interest group ratings on the basis of previous legislation. So they will rate candidates, and it's really hard to do it if the candidate hasn't served in any elected office. But for congressional candidates, for example, right? Maybe you have the incumbent. Well, certainly they voted on things in Congress, and you also have the challenger. Maybe they're a state senator. Well, they voted on different policies, right? But same topics in the state Senate. The interest group will evaluate that candidate based on all the votes that matter to them. And basically, it's like a pass-fail. You'll get a pass if you voted the way they wanted you to. You'll get a fail, of course, if you voted against how they wanted. And then you'll have a summary, a composite score. These interest group ratings are like, I always think of them like report cards, basically, right? An A is good and an F is bad. But much like endorsements, the inverse can be invaluable. Because if you have a candidate that receives an F from an interest group you don't like or support, you know that is going to be a candidate that you would prefer, that you would enjoy and appreciate. Now, I do have to add in terms of limitations, we're going to get back to presidential endorsements here, but there are limitations when we talk about these interest group ratings and endorsements, because not only, of course, you have to know the interest group, you have to like them, right? There's a lot of things that voters take into consideration, and though we'll explore that topic more later, when we're talking about interest groups, they're most impactful for single issue voters. Meaning, and I'm going to talk about one of the largest interest groups, right? The NRA, the National Rifle Association. If you like the National Rifle Association, you support gun rights in this country, right? Those ratings, those endorsements can matter a lot to you. It's also possible that you support the Second Amendment, but you feel strongly about other issues, right? Maybe you're agnostic, apathetic, I don't know. The Second Amendment is not a super important issue to you. You can see both sides of the argument, right? So you can understand how it's not going to be the end-all be-all for everyone, but for people who feel most strongly or people who prioritize those policies, those are the ones that are most important to them, right? That's where those interest group ratings and endorsements can matter a lot. Now, you're listening here on WICI 88.7 The Diamond. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson, and I want to take a quick pause here from our conversation in terms of endorsements, because right now we're going through our fund drive for WICR. And if you listen to this show, any of the awesome programming that we have, right, the music, all the jazz, you know that this is a really, really unique station. And in fact, we're the only station here in central Indiana that's dedicated to both classical and jazz music and programs like Positively Politics, right? One of the reasons that we're able to do this and other places aren't is, quite frankly, it's difficult, it's expensive, and it costs money to support things like this. And I want to ask you for your support for us, right? You're here listening, you're a part of our WICR community, and by giving a pledge, it reassures that you recognize the value that we're adding to your lives and also to the community with the kinds of programs the classical and jazz music that we're able to support here. So while we think this is important, of course, we can't do it alone, and we need your support. If you enjoy Positively Politics, if you enjoy the classical music and the jazz music that we have, right, other things you've heard here, great programs on WICR, please consider making a pledge. And you can do this at wicronline.org. Right? All you have to do is go to our website. And again, that's wicronline.org. And you can make a pledge, which is so meaningful for us, for the station, and to continue programs such as this. Now, as we're talking about endorsements here on Positively Politics, I focus on President Trump's endorsements, and in particular for a couple reasons. First and foremost, he has made a lot. But as I mentioned earlier, we saw Barack Obama in 2018. He had made several endorsements as well. A little different because, as you'll recall, Barack Obama had left office 2 years prior, still a significant figure within the Democratic Party. But I want to talk about the way in which endorsements can vary. So for starters, we've already established you got to be known, right? Donald Trump has that going for him, very well known. You do need to be liked. And I will say this is where in primaries, it can be tricky because you can look within the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and there's a wide range of folks, right? These are loose umbrella coalitions of groups that say, yes, we generally agree with this platform, but there's all sorts of different stripes, right? Different preferences and opinions that even within the party, and that's what I'm trying to stress here, within the party, you're going to see a lot of variance. So when we're talking about primary endorsements, this can be important, but it is not a guarantee. For Democrats, I'm looking at our last Democratic president, Barack Obama, I should say Joe Biden for most recent. Barack Obama's had more endorsements. That's why I'm thinking top of mind here. But you look at more recent Democratic presidents, there are going to be Democratic voters that like and appreciate and support that. There are going to be Democratic voters that do not. Right? Same thing when we're talking about Donald Trump, right? He himself can be controversial and divisive, and there's Republicans who will want that endorsement. There are Republicans who probably are less inclined. And I do want to defend myself here because I mentioned Barack Obama instead of Joe Biden, right? Just to give you a sense, in the last presidential election cycle, Joe Biden endorsed exactly 2 candidates. He endorsed more back in 2023, which was 24. The most candidates he has endorsed in his career as we've started keeping track of this, and I'll tell you, they keep track of this at Ballotopedia, by the way, which is a fantastic resource. Was in 2018, we saw Joe Biden make 129 endorsements, which, again, you might say, wow, it seems like a lot. But recall that this year alone, President Trump has made 263 endorsements. And then I mentioned earlier Barack Obama, and his highest year was going back to 2018, but he himself had made 342 endorsements that year. So lots of endorsements. Joe Biden has not endorsed as many candidates. But you need to be known, you need to be liked, okay? What else do you need to have? Well, for starters, there's a lot of research that shows celebrity status can be helpful. And not all elected officials are celebrities. There's a great paper that was published 10 years ago, I admit, right? It was actually in Celebrity Studies. That's the academic journal title back in 2016. It was in Atkinson and DeWitt. And both Atkinson and DeWitt are academics that are arguing that celebrity endorsements matter. And they found that these can be very influential in shaping political outcomes, in part based on how important those celebrities are to individuals. So, of course, you got to be known, you got to be liked. But different celebrities reach out to different audiences, right? They speak to different people. I think with this all the time when we watch ads just on general TV. So not the targeted ads you get on social media where they know my demographics. They're like, middle-aged white lady, this is what she's going to like, right? But just on general TV, like your traditional TV channels. And sometimes I'll watch an ad, I'll be like, ugh, that does not make me want to buy that product at all. And that's usually my first thought. And then my second thought is, I am not their target audience. Oftentimes I think of my 17-year-old son. I'm like, oh, yeah, he would look at that and think it was cool, right? Or maybe my husband in his late 40s would be like, oh, that looks neat, right? I am not the person they're trying to sell to. Although I will say a lot of times in, especially groceries, right? Cleaning, women are oftentimes the lead purchasers for the household, and I'm probably in general am one of those. So we're talking about that impact in terms of celebrity endorsement and understanding that sometimes you may feel like the endorsement doesn't speak to you, but you are not the primary candidate. Now, I want to talk about this related to Indiana. You knew I was getting there, right? So with President Trump's endorsements, they're especially influential this election cycle and notable this week because President Trump endorsed Liz Brown. She was a Republican state senator who supported redistricting, which is very important. But she does have a challenger who works as a staffer for U.S. Senator Jim Banks. And that's where it gets a little complicated because Jim Banks, just a few weeks ago, led a group, I believe it was 5 challengers seeking to unseat Republican senators in their primary elections this upcoming May 5th because they opposed redistricting. And Banks, as well as President Trump, who was most vocal about it and the impetus for the redistricting push in Indiana and across the country nationwide, right? They supported it. They said, no, we're going to target these people. So Jim Banks had supported candidates who challenged these incumbents that had ultimately opposed redistricting, right? A staff member from his own office, Derek Voigt, has filed to challenge incumbent Fort Wayne Senator Liz Brown. And Liz Brown ultimately earned Donald Trump's endorsement for her particular race. But Donald Trump has endorsed several candidates. In fact, 9 senators for the Republican Party in their primaries. Now, those were 9 senators who supported redistricting, right? And in some cases were heavy favorites. So sure, they had a challenger, but they don't seem to be a very strong challenger, or those that didn't even have opposition. Now, why does an endorsement matter in the primary if you don't have opposition? It doesn't really, right? It would be like winning the Good Housekeeping seal of approval for the best product in a category in which there are no other products, right? So you're not really competing against anyone. Still nice to have, right? Doesn't hurt. And as we've established, this president and some presidents, Barack Obama, give lots of endorsements. Others, I'm looking at you, Joe Biden, right, are pretty staged, not giving out a lot of endorsements. But Donald Trump does. So probably not surprising that he has weighed in to those races, right? He'd previously endorsed 6 other state senators, and these were among the folks that came with him to Washington, D.C., that got to meet in the Oval Office. And these are candidates that are seeking to unseat incumbent state Senate Republicans who had ultimately opposed redistricting. Now, you're listening here to WICR 88.7 The Diamond. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson, talking today on Positively Politics about the importance of endorsement. And an endorsement can be incredibly influential in an election, but it is not the end-all, be-all. I do want to emphasize why we see endorsements mattering, I guess. Why they have an impact when you consider how many things voters have to keep in mind. And I want to highlight here for a second, I haven't talked about this research for a very long time, right? But John Zoller was a famous political scientist and wrote, at the time, Cutting Edge Research. It's still the seminal text in terms of public opinion. And he wrote a book on mass public opinion, which he argued that people have a lot of information. They have to organize it in their mind. So when we're thinking about voting, we're thinking about different candidates, parties, policies, there's a lot. There's a lot to remember. There's a lot of clutter. There's a lot of stuff. And so he created a RAS model. He called it receive, accept, and sample. And that you would receive lots of information. Some of it you would reject if it was not something you already agreed with, if it countered what you believed to be true, if it was about a candidate you already thought different political party, I don't like what they stand for, right? Like, you're not going to internalize all of that, but you will accept some of that information, right? And then in almost like this funnel, there's a political science term, funnel of causality. That's not related to John Zoller, but it's the basic idea here, right? You'll accept some things. Some of those will funnel down to the receive, accept, sample. What you're going to use, what you're ultimately going to sample from and pick from and use as being most important in what you decide. And for the funnel of causality, we'd say, right, in American politics, partisanship is going to be really important for most people. Not everyone, but for a lot of people, right? If you're a single issue voter, whatever that single issue is, we talked about that earlier with interest years, right? That's going to be really important. For some people, the candidates themselves. But the reason, this is what I'm building up to here, I know you were wondering, the reason why endorsements matter so much is because we have so much information. And so for many voters, they are overwhelmed with how much information there is and also a lack of genuinely helpful information. There's a lot of research, most recently Delhi Carpini and Keeter, but there's a lot of research that shows Americans are generally not very knowledgeable on politics, despite the fact that we have lots of access to political information. And what we can make sense of that paradox is to say that just because there's a lot of information doesn't mean people understand how to use it or how it applies or what is most important, right? And so we can't just assume that information existing is going to be information that is used. So for having endorsements, you're able to effectively streamline the process. Because if you know, again, you know the candidate, you like the candidate, right? If it's a candidate endorsing somebody else, if it's the president or if it's a celebrity, but it's someone well-known and it's someone you liked, you're able to apply that and use that. And for some voters where they are overwhelmed by the amount of information they have received and accepted, and now they're trying to sample it, that celebrity endorsement, right, like that big name endorsement, might in fact matter a lot. That may be the telltale sign. When we talk about endorsements on the whole, I think it's helpful for us to remember that not only do they not all matter, let's talk about the difference in terms of the actual elections. So one of the things the research suggests is that endorsements can matter a lot in local races relative to state, right? And endorsements can likewise matter more in state races compared to federal. And again, this is an information problem. In this case, we'd say typically local informations and some of those statewide elections, right? Those are low information elections. So for those local races, the lowest of the low in terms of information are going to be those that are nonpartisan. So you're stripping away the one cognitive shortcut that most Americans will use to decide whether or not they like or dislike a candidate, right? You don't have partisanship. Oh, shoot, how am I going to decide, right? But those local races where there's no partisanship, and if they're not districted and it's an at-large seat, that makes it especially complicated because now if you're thinking like a city council race, for example, you don't know where that person's from. So you're not in a district, they're not from your district. In a district, a single member district, you have both only voters can participate in voting for that district's candidates, and only people who live in that district can run as candidates. If it's at large, it's throughout the entire city or municipality, so that makes it harder too. So those endorsements can be very influential because, again, with limited information in what we call low information elections, like local elections, and quite frankly, sometimes for folks in state elections too, having an endorsement is a simple shortcut, but a beneficial way for voters to evaluate which candidate they'd support and which ones they don't. Now, you're listening here on WICR 88.7 The Diamond. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson, talking for Positively Politics about endorsement. But I want to take one more pause just to remind you, if you haven't heard, this week we are a part of our big spring fund drive. And it's going on through today. Today's actually our last day. But we're hoping that you will consider programs like this, the great classical music you hear on the station, the wonderful jazz, right? And what we're able to bring to in terms of unique and meaningful programs that are so special and near and dear to our hearts. I will tell you, it is a privilege to get to do this show. This show's almost been on air for 10 years. It is one of the great highlights of my life, and it's such fun. It gives me so much joy and excitement to share politics with you for half an hour every Saturday morning. I hope you get that kind of enthusiasm, that joy, that kind of experience from all of the programs we produce here on WICR. But as you know, a lot of places just can't do this, and there are fewer and fewer across the state. We're the only radio station in Central Indiana that's dedicated to programs like Positively Politics, but also jazz and classical, because it's just incredibly expensive. So I want to ask you to consider making a pledge. Today is our last day of the pledge drive, but to help support radio voice for jazz and classical, for programs such as this one. And in order to provide that support, right, you can go online to our website, and that's at wicronline.org. Again, that's wicronline.org. And whatever you can do, we find so very helpful. If you like what we do, we hope that you're able to provide some support. And I just want to say, truly, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Thank you for listening to this show. If you're able to support it financially, thank you for supporting it. But thank you for being here. It is genuinely a fun, exciting, privilege, such a neat opportunity to do. So again, you can go to wicronline.org. Today's our last day of our Spring Pledge Live, where we appreciate support from listeners like you. Now, as we're winding down our conversation here for Positively Politics this morning, I've talked a lot about endorsements. I do want to talk about their effectiveness on the whole, right? So if we're looking in terms of Donald Trump's endorsements, we'll look first at the 2026 election cycle, right? We have not gone through all the primaries, but Ballotopedia, which keeps track of this data, is actually a super helpful resource, even though I do feel weird because it sounds a lot like Wikipedia, and I feel odd as an expert in the field recommending a website that sounds like Wikipedia, but I promise it's good, right? Ballotopedia, right? They show right now 24% primary success rate. Now that number will invariably increase because we haven't had our primaries yet, right? And we're coming up to the Super Tuesday. I don't know if we really call them that in congressional midterms, but that's what they are. We're coming up to the March primaries, where you're going to see several states with their primary elections. Of course, ours are not going to be until May 5th. But seeing the success of these can be really helpful, because it does give you a sense of how popular not just the candidates are, quite frankly, but of the people they're supporting, right? So when we're looking at a high success rate, we'd say, wow, a good batting average. And I know I kind of picked on President Joe Biden before, is that he doesn't make a lot of endorsements. I might have used the word stingy, right? But there's also an important thing to consider, which is a high batting average. And that's oftentimes referred to in politics as chief executives, whether at the state level it's the governor or at the federal level it's the president, wanting to only support select programs and really promote, like, these are my 3 key policy areas this legislative session. So that way, if they pass, then you're like 100%, right? I'm batting for 100%. But I do want to mention this for Joe Biden, though he's been more frugal, let's say. He's been more cautious. He doesn't make as many endorsements as Presidents Obama and Trump, right? I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it. He had a primary success rate of 100% back in 2024 with the solid 2, count them 1, 2 endorsements that he made in that presidential election cycle. Now, that endorsement, of course, will vary in terms of how much it carries weight. I want to add, for presidential endorsements, we're not just talking about, like, oh, the president themselves can be divisive, but we understand that presidential approval changes. So in this election cycle, one of the things we have to consider is how much weight does the president carry? Now, when we're talking about President Trump, and I'm talking about these state Senate races, the short answer is a lot. Will it be the end-all, be-all? No, I don't think so, right? Money still matters quite a bit in politics, just in general, right? A lot of politics is local, so for some of these state senators, they are well-known in their community. They have done a lot to support their community, right? So they are not going to be easily unseated, right, by any challenger. But when we think about those endorsements, Indiana's a state that Trump won handedly 3 times, if not by landslide margins, which we typically indicate is 20%, by significant margins. So when we're talking about a Republican primary, these are going to be more extreme, more conservative voters. Sure, there are going to be some people there that do not care for the top of the ticket president. There's going to be a lot of people that do. So I do think you'll see that matter here. Now, the question, of course, is after that, what kind of impact does this have in the general election? It's less of an endorsement game than at that point, much more of a candidate ideological position where they fall on the 7-point Likert scale. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We still get 2 more months, 1 more month really at this point. Let's say a month and a week of excitement leading up to our primaries. And that's just what we're going to cover here again next week, as we do every Saturday morning at 11:30 here on WICR 88.7 The Diamond. For Positively Politics, I want to thank you for tuning in. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson.